My name is Patrice Hamilton. Welcome to Tunxis Community College's Humanities Series Spring Writers Event. That's a long one. But we're glad to have you here. And I have to admit that I only read my first Amy Bloom novel last summer. So I guess you could call me a late bloomer. I know. I can't resist a cheesy pun. I never have been able to. I was hoping that that would be okay. But anyway, so last summer I stumbled upon Love Invents Us at the Southington Public Library. And if you've read that novel, then you know it's fearless. I mean, if there's one thing about Amy Bloom is that she's not afraid to go wherever her characters want to take her. And I personally respond to that. And you know you like a novelist and that you connect with her when you immediately go out and try to get every other book she's ever written. And so I went back to my library 2 weeks later and I got Away. And that was, for me, it was very different. It was like, Love Invents Us is such an intimate novel, you know, intimate story, I felt, you know, and then Away was so like bigger than life kind of, you know, big story about the resilience of love and the resilience of immigrants. At least that's how I, you know, responded to it. So after that, I wanted to get her collections of short stories, but my library did not have them. Somebody was taking them out and not returning them. So I ordered them online, and I first read Come to Me, and then I read in quick succession Where the God of Love Hangs Out, and I loved them both. And so I was really happy when I looked on the back and finally read the little bio about you, that Amy Bloom lives in Connecticut. And when I contacted her, I was just so pleased that she could come to Tunxis and share her thoughts on writing and on getting published and on different genres, writing for different genres, and on anything else that you guys are interested in. One thing I really like about your writing is that not only do you tell stories that I really love, but you also, I feel like you let characters play by their own rules. And then what's really fun for me as a reader is to try to figure out what those rules are. And so without any further delay, I'd like you to help me welcome Amy Bloom.
Sorry, I'm still catching my breath a little bit. A couple of things. I have to say, the idea tonight was to talk about storytelling of all kinds, and so I'm going to read a little bit from a new novel that I'm working on, and then a little bit from Little Sweet Potato. For those of you who have young kids, I don't feel that I didn't read my work to my kids when they were little, so I'm just going to make that as a suggestion, and whatever you feel comfortable with is okay with me, but my kids didn't read my work till they were older. I'm going to read a little bit from this novel, then I'll read a little bit from Little Sweet Potato, then I'll talk about how all good writing is the same, and then I would very much like it if you all have questions. It would be great if you had answers, but if you have questions, that would be fine, about anything to do with your writing, your reading, other people's writing, or any aspects of the craft or the business that's interesting to you. I'm all yours. The book is called Lucky Us. This is the first chapter. This is how the book begins. It's set in 1941 in the United States. And the first chapter is called I'd Know You Anywhere. The narrator is Eva, who is 12. My father's wife died. My mother said we should drive down to his place right away and see what might be in it for us. My mother tapped my nose with her grapefruit spoon. It's like this, she said. Your father loves us more, but he's got another family, a wife, and a girl a little older than you. His other wife had all the money. Wipe your face, she said. There was no one like my mother for straight talk. She washed my neck and ears until they shone. We helped each other dress. Her lilac dress with the underarm zipper, my pink one with the tricky buttons. And my mother did my braids so tight my eyes pulled up. She took her violet hat and her best gloves, and she ran across the road to borrow Mr. Portman's car. I was glad to be going, and I thought I could get to be glad about having a sister. I wasn't sorry my father's other wife died. We had waited for him for weeks. My mother sat by the window in the morning and smoked through supper every night. And when she came home from work at Hobson's, she was in a bad mood, even after I rubbed her feet. I hung around the house all July, playing with Mr. Portman's poodle, waiting for my father to drive up. When he came, he usually came by 2 o'clock in case there was a fireside chat that day. We listened to all the fireside chats together. We loved President Roosevelt. On Sundays, when my father came, he bought a pack of Lucky Strikes for my mother and a Hershey bar for me. And after supper, my mother sat in his lap and I sat right on his slippers. And if there was a fireside chat, my father did his FDR imitation. "Good evening, friends," he said, and he stuck a straw in his mouth like a cigarette holder. "Good evening, ladies and gentlemen." He bowed to my mother and said, "Eleanor, my dear, how about a waltz?" And they danced to the radio for a while, and then it was my bedtime. My mother put a few bobby pins in my hair for curls, and my father carried me to bed singing, "I wish I could shimmy like my sister Kate." And then he tucked me in and shimmied out the door. On Monday mornings he was gone, and I waited until Thursday and sometimes until next Sunday. My mother parked the car and redid her lipstick. My father's house was 2 stories of red stone and tall windows with fringed lace curtains behind and wide brown steps stacked like boxes in front of the shining wood door. "Your father does like to have things nice while he's away," she said. "It sure is nice," I said. "We ought to live here." And my mother smiled at me and ran her tongue over her teeth. "Could be," she said. "You never know." She'd already told me she was tired of Abingdon, where we'd been since I was born. It was no kind of real town, she said, and she was fed up to hear with hostessing at Hobson's. And we talked about finding ourselves a better life in Chicago. "Chicago, Chicago, that toddling town." I sang as we got out of the car, and I did a few dance steps like in the movies. My mother said, "You are the bee's knees, kiddo," and she grabbed the back of my dress. She licked her palm and pressed it to my bangs so they wouldn't fly up, and she straightened her skirt and told me to check her seams. "Straight as arrows," I said, and we went up the stairs hand in hand. My mother knocked, and my father answered the door in the blue vest he wore at our house during the president's speeches. My father hugged me, and my parents whispered to each other while I stood there trying to see more of the parlor, which was as big as our whole apartment and filled with flowers. "Maybe," my father said, "what the hell are you doing here?" Maybe my mother cursed him for staying away, but I doubt it. My father played the gentleman his whole life, and my mother must have said to me 100 times that men need to be handled right, and a woman who couldn't handle her man had only herself to blame. When I say men are dogs, she'd say, I'm not being insulting. I like dogs. Behind my father, I saw a tall girl. "My daughter Iris," my father said, and I could hear my mother breathe in. "Iris," he said, "this is my friend, Mrs. Logan, and her daughter, her lovely daughter, Eva." I knew, standing in their foyer, that this girl had a ton of things I didn't have. She had flowers in crystal vases the size of buckets and pretty light brown curls and my father's hand on her shoulder. She wore a baby blue sweater and a white blouse with a bluebird pin on the collar. I think she wore stockings. Iris was 16 and she looked like a grown woman to me. She looked like a movie star. My father pushed us to the stairs and told Iris to entertain me in her room while he and my mother had a chat. "Picture this," Iris said. She lay on her bed and I sat on the braided rug. She gave me a couple of gumdrops and I was happy to sit there. She was a great talker and a perfect mimic. The whole college came to my mother's funeral. My grandfather used to be the president of the college, but he had a stroke last year, so now he doesn't. There was this one girl at the funeral, red hair, really awful redhead, like they don't cook long enough or something. "I think Paulette Goddard's a redhead," I said. I had read this in Photoplay last week. "How old are you, 10? Who the hell wants to be Paulette Goddard?" Anyway, this redheaded girl comes back to our house and she's just crying away. So this lady, our neighbor, Mrs. Drysdale, says to her, "Were you very close to dear Mrs. Acton?" And the way Iris said this, I could just see Mrs. Drysdale sticking her nose and keeping her spotted veil out of her mouth while she ate, her wet hanky stuffed into her big bosom, which my mother had told me was a disgusting thing to do. "I'm 12, I said. Iris said, "My mother was like a saint. Everybody says so. I didn't want people thinking that my mother wasted her time on this stupid girl, so I turn around and I say that none of us even know who this girl is." And she runs into the powder room downstairs. This is the funny part. The door gets stuck and she can't get out. So she has to bang on the door, and 2 of the professors have to jimmy it open. It was funny. Iris told me that the whole college, I didn't know my father taught at a college. If you had asked me, I would have said that he read books for a living. came to the chapel to grieve for her mother, to offer sympathy to her and her father. She says that all of their family friends were there, which was her way of telling me that my mother could not really be a friend of her father's. We heard the voices downstairs, and then a door shut, and then the piano playing Good for You, Bad for Me. I didn't know my father played the piano. Iris and I stood at her bedroom door, leaning into the hall. We heard the toilet flush, which was embarrassing but reassuring, and then my father started playing the Moonlight Sonata, and then we heard a car's engine. Iris and I ran downstairs. My mother had left the front door open and just slipped into Mr. Portman's car. She'd set a brown tweed suitcase on the front porch. I stood on the porch holding the suitcase, looking at the road. My father sat down in the rocker and pulled me on his lap, which he had stopped doing last year. He asked me if I thought my mother was coming back, and I asked him, "Do you think my mother is coming back?" My father asked me if I had any other family on my mother's side, and I laid my head on his shoulder. I had seen my father most Sundays and some Thursdays since I was a baby, and the whole rest of my family was my mother. I was friendly with Mr. Portman and his poodle, and all of my teachers had taken an interest in me, and that was the sum of what you could call my family. Iris opened the screen door, and she looked at me the way a cat looks at a dog. We sat down to meatloaf and mashed potatoes, and the third time Iris told me to get my elbows off the table. "This isn't a boarding house," she said. My father said to her, "Behave yourself. She's your sister." Iris left the room, and my father told me to improve my manners. "You're not living in that dreadful town anymore, and you're not Eva Logan anymore," he said. "You're Eva Acton. We'll say you're my niece." I was 13 before I understood that my mother wasn't coming back to get me. So while I was working on that novel, it took me a long time because I did some other things in between, including a couple of television projects, I thought that I would write down the story that I used to tell my girls, my little sweet potatoes. So I'm going to read a couple of pages to you exactly as I would if you were in nursery school, because that's who this book is for. I was very lucky to get, I have to say, to get this illustrator, a guy named Noah Z. Jones, whose work I like very much. I don't think anybody else makes a better sweet potato. Once upon a time, there was a little sweet potato who lived in a garden patch where the earth was rich and brown and the air smelled sweet and spicy. He had never been anywhere else at all. Just as little sweet potato was beginning to get a look at the world around him, there was a terrible quaking and shaking, and everyone in the garden patch held on to their vines for dear life. Little sweet potato got shaken loose and landed plop in the middle of a new and not so nice place. Where am I, he wondered, and how do I get back home? And how will I know home when I get there? There was no one to answer him. Little sweet potato pulled together all of his sweet potato courage and went rolling over to a garden patch at the edge of the road. "Excuse me," little sweet potato said very politely. "Do I belong here?" Now, if you were 3 years old, I would be saying to you, "And what are those vegetables?" And then you would be screaming back, "Carrots." But we don't have to do that tonight. They looked at him. They looked at one another. They fluffed their leafy green tops and wiggled their long orange bodies. "We think not," they said. "You are lumpy, dumpy, and we have to say it, lumpy. You don't belong here." Little sweet potato rolled away as quickly as he could. He didn't know the world had such mean vegetation in it. Trying to be brave, little sweet potato rolled off to another patch, hoping things would go a little better and a little nicer. "Excuse me," said little sweet potato. "I wonder, do you think there might be a place for me in this garden?" They looked at him, and they looked at each other. "Well, let me think," the biggest rumbled. "Nope. See, we're handsome and purple, skin like satin. The fact is, you're dumpy, you're bumpy, you're kind of lumpy. What I'm trying to say is, pal, scram." And the little sweet potato rolled away. He didn't know the world had such scary vegetation in it. "I'm down, but I'm not out," said little sweet potato bravely, and even though his feelings were mashed very soft and tender from all the rough handling, he rolled himself to the edge of another garden. "Excuse me," he said, "do you think maybe I could move in next to you?" "Oh my goodness," they giggled. Their long green arms covered their velvety blue and yellow faces. "Oh dear, we don't think so. You're not even a flower. You're a lumpy, bumpy, dumpy vegetable. And we're beautiful. No offense." And they waved goodbye as little sweet potato rolled off. The rest of the day was just as bad. Bunches of round fruit, shiny and bright as green marbles, told him to get lost again if you're 3. This is where you scream grapes. Pink and puffy and sweet-smelling flowers with soft petals and sharp stickers told him there was no room in their garden. And curvy, green-striped vegetables with bent necks and beautiful yellow flowers told him to shove off. This caused a lot of discussion at one nursery school because somebody yelled out, "Corn." And as you know, there was always that little girl who has to say, "No, zucchini." And she was there. "That's it," said little sweet potato. "There is just no place for me. I am all alone," he thought, and one big tear rolled down his bumpy sweet potato face. "Hey you, little sweet potato! You, bumpy, bumpalicious!" Who, me? Little sweet potato didn't know he was being called. Was he a sweet potato? Was he bumpalicious? "You sweet, you neat, you got that gorgeous sunset color, you're a sweet potato, roll on over here." Little sweet potato did roll toward the voice, his little sweet potato heart beating fast. There's a little sign here that Noah made which says Hodgepodge Lodge, and beneath it he made a little sign that says vacancy. "Excuse me," he said when he got to the patch. "What for? We're just so glad you found your way back home," a lumpy, dumpy, and wonderfully bumpy sweet potato said very kindly. "Home?" said little sweet potato. He felt himself glowing as brightly as the sun. "I'm home?" "Absolutely," said the big, bumpy, and magnificently lumpy sweet potato. "And in the world's greatest garden, with fruits and vegetables and some flowers so fancy I don't even know what they are." "Some just like their own kind," said one of the pansies sweetly. "But we're the kind that like all kinds." "You're so nice," said little sweet potato. "I met some flowers who looked just like you, but they weren't very nice." "Some are, some aren't," said a friendly carrot. "We are." "That's how it is, kid," said a gleaming eggplant. "It's not all mulch and sunshine out there." "Oh, I know," said little sweet potato. "All kinds," said the big sweet potato. "Teeny and tall, big and small, fat as a ball, skinny as a stick." Of course, I happen to think that lumpy, dumpy, and bumpy is especially nice. "Me too," said little sweet potato. At least he thought he said it. He was getting awfully sleepy. He rolled onto a patch on a spot that seemed just the right size, little sweet potato size. He nestled into the rich brown earth and gazed at the sky and the trees and the vegetables and the flowers, and he settled down with a smile on his sweet potato face. How wonderful to be a sweet potato. How wonderful to be home at last. There you are. There's something very gratifying as a writer to be able to read you the entire book in under 10 minutes. Doesn't usually happen. I think people often have fantasies about writing. One fantasy is that short stories are easy, but novels are hard. That short stories are practice for novels. Another fantasy is that children's books are easy. All that's required is that you would have been a child at some time. But it's not true in either case. I had a wonderful time writing Little Sweet Potato, and it was a story that I had told to my kids for many, many years. But one of the things that you have to really pay attention to with a children's book in many ways, like with an adult book, is sort of what is the implication of what you're saying. I'll tell you, in my first version of Little Sweet Potato, I had Little Sweet Potato getting rejected by all the fruits and vegetables, and then finding his way to a sweet potato patch. And then I thought, is that really what I want to say? You know, sort of vegetable segregation, that you can only be if you are a sweet potato, you can only be happy with other sweet potatoes. And I thought, I didn't really want to say that. And then I thought, well, then maybe I was going to have him be in a garden where everybody had sort of his same personality. And I thought, well, I didn't really want personality segregation either, although it is true that it is a patch of nice fruits and vegetables and flowers. And part of my interest, I had actually taught nursery school a long time ago, was writing something for the kids who are sometimes standing a little bit outside the group. You know, and having been myself a weird little kid, I was not prepared to argue that they are always wrong. You know, that, oh, if you just walk over to that group, they're going to say, that's great, come on over here with your crazy hair and your smudgy glasses or your braces or your wheelchair or whatever it is. Come on over, we'd love to have you come. Because they don't always say that. Sometimes they just go, ooh. And so I wanted to write something about perseverance as well, and having enough self-respect and affection for oneself to persevere and to look for the people who were your kind of people, whatever that might be, in their natures, not necessarily in their exteriors. And so it turned out that, although I didn't do as many revisions for Little Sweet Potato as I do for my adult fiction, because that is usually around 30 full-length revisions. I did a lot, and that's partially because what I feel is that if you are writing, the greatest opportunity you're ever going to get is revision, is rewriting, is making it better. Every sentence. You know, there's a great letter from Lincoln in which he sends about a 5-page letter, and he writes at the top, I'm so sorry that this is so long. Had I had more time, I could have made it better and shorter. That's always what you want to do. Longer is not better. Thicker is not better. More fancy words is not better. The goal is to say it as simply and clearly as possible without dressing it up. Language is not more beautiful because it is more ornate. You know, sometimes the most beautiful construction is the simplest, which is part of the charm, actually, of children's books. But it calls for the same energy in polishing. The great pleasure, of course, in the children's book is you get a collaborator. And that's a wonderful opportunity. You don't really get one. There are other kinds of writing. You know, in television you get more collaborators than you know what to do with. In children's books you get one. And in fiction you get none at all. It is just you in your little boat making the best decisions that you can. I would really be delighted to answer questions about any aspect of reading or writing for television, for the big screen, translation. I'm all yours for a little while. And if it's too personal, I won't answer. Yes, sir.
I wanted to ask about character development. Do you imagine characters before you even write them, or the 7th draft where they come alive, the 12th draft? When did the characters take place?
For me, my work, did people hear the question? I was asking about development of character. My work is so centered in character, I don't really have much of a choice. Until I can hear one of the central characters, just one, it's dead. I have nothing to say. I don't write science fiction, you know. I don't write military history. I can't go after the big boom. I can only go after the story, and the story is really based on the people. It's partially because I believe that in books, as in real life, after you're about 18, events do not make you who you are, they just reveal who you are. And so my goal is to know the character so I can begin to reveal the character, and certainly things will happen in the book that change things. But I have to have some sense of who these people are, how they are like me and how they are not like me, so that I can write them. It has never been the case for me that a character came out of an event. It's always the other way around. And so I do spend a lot of time staring at the ceiling, thinking about these people and waiting to hear them and doing everything I can to coax them out. That in itself usually takes a few months. Yes?
You said you were very fortunate to get the illustrator. Could you tell that story of how you found him?
Sure. I had submitted the book to HarperCollins, which said they would like to publish it, and they sent me back 6 illustrators and their portfolios online. And then I sort of narrowed it down to 2, and then I asked my 2 nieces, who were at that time 3 and 5, whose work they liked the better. And Nosy Jones was the Maggie Nora winner. And I also liked the energy. I mean, we had differences. There were a couple of portraits at moments in the book in which Little Sweet Potato looks, rather than wounded and surprised, he looks homicidal. And I was like, that's a different book. You know, I'm not saying you're wrong, but, you know, the point at which he lays into the eggplant. And so he said, oh, I'm so sorry, because there was another one in which he's sort of falling into the ravine, in which he doesn't look upset. He looks like he's on the verge of death. And I was like, I didn't want the stakes to be that high, you know, because the readers are 3 to 5. And we love working together, and we hope to do another book together.
Yes. If a writer is writing something and they don't like most of what they're writing, do they scrap it or just try to fix what they don't like?
I think first of all, I think that if you write a lot, what you experience is that you fail every day. Every single day, most of what you write is going to be garbage. And what's required is that you have to have the stamina and the hopefulness to throw it in the garbage and to keep the sentences that are good. For a lot of us, you know, if you're not writing full-time, you write part-time, you write in between work or kids or school or all the other things that you do, it's excruciating to look at the 4 paragraphs you have been sweating bullets over and think, not so good. So there are 2 things that happen. One is that we kid ourselves. And I would say if you are a writer, you should be reading your work out loud with very little inflection, and you will be able to hear in every line what the problem is. You might not know how to fix it, but you can certainly hear where the problems are. And the other thing is you have to be willing to believe that the next day or the day after that, you'll do better. And so, you know, what I always say is, go through it, circle the sentences that you think are really strong, and put the rest away. You don't have to actually throw it in the trash can. The computer makes this really easy for us. You can start a folder, as a friend of mine did on her computer, and the name of the folder is Not Quite. And so you can have a folder of sentences that are not quite good enough, not quite to the point, don't really do what you want them to do. So some people scrap it all. Some people scrap most, and there are people, I'm sure, who cannot bear to scrap any, and they just try to, you know, sort of fix it a little bit. But you know, there is a point in which you feel like it's a failed makeover. You know, that putting, you know, that insisting that you have to keep it because after all you wrote it and it took so much of your time, you're not serving your work. You know, you're serving your own feelings about it, and I don't blame anybody for that. I only started writing 20 years ago, and I worked full-time, and I had 3 kids, and believe me, every time I had to throw out a page, I almost wept to think, you know, there was another 2 a.m. come and gone, and the page was no better for it. But in the end, you have to decide if you are writing to be read, or you are writing because you wish to write. If you're writing because you wish to write, you don't have to throw anything out. You're writing because you wish other people who don't know you and don't like you and don't owe you any favors are reading your work. You have to be a little tougher.
What comes first?
Usually write from an idea. I mean, there are books that have their origin in ideas. somebody may want to tell the story of 9/11, or they want to tell the story of the Iraq War. That's not usually the kind of thing that motivates me. First of all, if it was what I wanted to do, I'd probably write an essay rather than a novel. Often the big idea results in an interesting book with very few characters. There are these little cardboard figures who move through the action, but they never really come alive, because what dominates the book is the idea and the writing in support of the idea, not making people present. So I tend, yeah, it is an idea, but the problem is it is only an idea. And
Well, making people present.
no, that's sort of the function of writing if you have characters. If you're writing about nature, you're off the hook. You know, you don't have to give each blackbird its own individual personality, because that would be a different kind of book. But it's not, I don't think that making the characters come alive is a concept. It's actually the function of storytelling. Is that I should be able to tell you a story. It's a wonderful book called The Art of Fiction by John Gardner, in which he says, the function of writing fiction is to create a dream that the reader enters. And every time the writer makes a mistake, every time we screw up in word choice, in an action that's not believable, in a character that doesn't make any sense, in dialogue that doesn't sound like the characters we've created, we destroy the dream. And our job is to make it possible for the reader to enter the dream on page 1 and not leave until they close the book. If you say so. I mean, I suppose it is. I mean, I think if it's what you do, it's, you know, it's an interesting idea in the same way that pouring the foundation in order to build a house in the Northeast is an interesting idea. It is an interesting idea. It's also essential. Yes, sir.
How do you feel with the new technology now, with electronic books and everything being online? Do you use that towards your advantage? How do you feel about that? Do you put your books online? Or?
Yeah, I mean, my books are available online, and for my last collection of short stories, we had an arrangement with Amazon where people could buy a story for 99 cents, just one, as a way of previewing the collection, and that was really successful. I don't really care. I mean, first of all, the kind of stuff I write, Little Sweet Potato notwithstanding, is what they call literary fiction. You know, it's not romance, it's not a mystery, it's not a cookbook, it's not a travel guide, it's not a memoir, and so, you know, it's not really a booming category, and so it doesn't make much of a difference to me. I know that how people read on Kindles is actually different than how they read when they hold a book in their hand, but it is not for me to say to people, don't use Kindles. It's a different experience. I am sure that 20 years from now, when I am too old to care, it will have altered some of the ways in which people read and some of their expectations about books. Even as now, you know, somebody who grows up really using a computer a lot, you know, with the terrific skills that somebody, I would say, under 18 has in particular, reads differently. They are used to bursts of information in a different way. Their standards for things like facts, about which they would call them facts, as opposed to things that are true, you know, may be different than somebody who grew up reading a newspaper, who wasn't, you know, submerged in communication 24 hours a day. So I know that it will change certain kinds of things. I also know that it's inevitable. And in some sense, to be a writer and to complain about that, you know, is like going back in time and saying, absolutely not, no telephones. It's like, that ship has sailed. People will use electronic devices. There will be more and more of them. They will be more and more hybrid, and people will read on them. And some people will go on writing 600-page novels, and some people will not. Since I don't write 600-page novels, it's not as hard for me as it is for somebody else. Yes?
Who are some of your favorite writers? Who do you like to read?
I like to read lots of people. I have fairly eclectic tastes. When I'm writing, which is what I'm doing now, I only read poetry, because I can't. When I was writing my first book, as I said, I did late at night, like between 10 and 1 in the morning, a few nights a week. I was reading Reynolds Price, who's a wonderful Southern novelist, and suddenly I found that characters in my stories were saying things like, "That dog won't hunt." And since I'm from New York, and my characters were in New York, I kept thinking, who are you? You know, and people were using all these really Southern folksy terms. I thought, that's it. I cannot read another novelist when I'm writing. And so I read a lot of poets. I like everybody from Auden to Emily Dickinson to Mark Doty to Jane Hirschfield to Donald Hall to Jane Kenyon. I read a lot of poetry. I think to Zimborska, I think if you are serious about writing fiction and you don't read poetry, I think you're making a terrible mistake. I think you are missing out on people who really know how to get the biggest bang for the buck in terms of word choice and syntax. Again, when I'm writing, I read mysteries because it's sort of mind candy. The very first thing I ever wrote was a mystery because I thought, oh, I understand this form. Well, it turns out that I understood it, but I was not actually able to execute it. So I finished this novel, and I sent it to my one and only reader, who was my high school English teacher, who loved me very much and was always very encouraging. And I said, what do you think? And he wrote back, and he said, sweetheart, you know, the characters are wonderful, the dialogue is so snappy. I don't know much about mysteries, but shouldn't there be more than one suspect? And I thought that is an excellent point, but unfortunately I couldn't come up with another one. So I finished the book, and my publisher actually bought the mystery as well as the first short story collection, and I just thought it was so terrible I bought it back. The next time I got in advance, I thought, you know, no tree should be dying for this. So, and you know, I have a stack of books I'm looking forward to. Sometimes I'm on a prize committee, and so I will get a chance to look at a lot of wonderful first novels or a year's crop of novels, and that usually keeps me going for a couple of years because they're usually, when you judge the National Book Award, for example, you have to read approximately 300 books. So that keeps you going for a while. Yes?
Do you have a process or tips for character development?
I think the heart of the character development is actually a capacity for empathy. There are really two things. It's observation and it's empathy. And I would say, if you cannot drum up actual interest in the feelings and wishes of other human beings, you're probably not going to be much of a writer. Doesn't mean you have to be a nice person, but you do have to have an interest in what goes on in other people. You have to be interested in what does the world look like from there as opposed to from here. You know, what's that like? When that nice young man was running back and forth to put the tray on the table, and then when he was, I thought, gearing up for the third time, at which point I thought I would just like hurl myself across the room. You know, I had to sort of say to myself, you know what, Amy, and what is it like for him? What is it like for him to be running back and forth, hoping he's not interrupting anything, trying to do his job? And if that doesn't occur to you ever, what is it like for somebody else? You can't write, because you can never enter anybody else's personality. To write a character is not to describe them. It is to be them. Villains do not see themselves as villains. Villains always see themselves as victims. She made me. He made me. I had no choice. No one understands how hard it is to be me. That's how they feel. So just to describe them in villainous terms is not to do your job. You have to see the world through their eyes. You have to be them. Which means that you have to be prepared to be all sorts of things that are not so nice to be. You know? But I always say to people, you don't have to have embezzled $1 million to know what it is to embezzle. You only have to have ever in your life stolen a candy bar. Because if you stole a candy bar when you're 8 years old, you know all there is to know about guilt and fear and humiliation and anxiety about getting caught and relief and panic. And you can apply that when you do a little research, to the embezzler. You don't have to have embezzled. You know, and it goes that way across the lines. People get very anxious about writing from the point a character who's not the same gender. People get very anxious about writing a character who's not the same color or the same ethnicity or the same religion. And we all start from what we know. But if you want to branch out a little bit, you have to kind of use a certain amount of that projection. You have to try to imagine what it is like to be them. So I spent a lot of time doing that. And I also spent a lot of time listening to other people, different kinds of people. I do a lot of eavesdropping. Yes, way in the back.
I have a question. There's actually a similar book called Sport that has kind of the same concept as the Little Superhero. So I was just wondering, how do you come up with the concept of certain concepts for little children and portray it in a way that they would understand in a context where, you know, parents are also interested as well, like not the goodnight moon again for the millionth time, you know. How do you come up with kind of an idea or a concept for those things?
Well, I think it depends, you know, like any other act of fiction, it depends on what you're interested in. I mean, when you said, you know, sport, it's like, there are no new stories, whether they are children's books or adult fiction. You know, probably somebody Greek, if you are writing a novel, wrote about it several thousand years ago, and you're not going to beat it. You know, as Willa Cather said, there are only 5 human stories, right? What's extraordinary is how often they repeat themselves. It's probably true with children's book too. So, you know, you write as you are. You write your own temperament. See, I don't mind Goodnight Moon. The thing that was the bane of my existence was the pokey little puppy, which still the mention of makes me want to do nothing except pour myself a vodka. I couldn't believe it. You know, my adorable youngest child would bring it out from under the covers, and it was like that moment in a horror movie. You know, and I would say, "How about that?" She'd go, "Pokey little puppy." And so then I'd read it, and of course I'd try to skip a few pages because they're all exactly the same. And she would go, "No, you forgot the part where he lifted his right paw." So I didn't want to write that. But I think, you know, there's sort of, when you're writing for very small children, you know the parents are going to be buying the book. When you start to write for older children, it's more complicated actually, because the publisher is very interested in the book that a child would pick out for him or herself. And so that's the kind of thing that leads to Captain Underpants rather than Goodnight Moon. You know, so it helps to have a pretty good grip on your own childhood and what you liked and didn't like. So, but I would say, you know, don't be afraid to try the story that you want to tell. And the great thing about children's books is that they're short. And so if that's not a hit, you can go on to the next. And then you can go on to the next. And I don't mean it's like sort of, you know, just tossing darts at a dartboard, but it is, because they are short, it's a wonderful opportunity to keep playing with ideas, maybe to pursue even 3 at once until you get to the one that really seems to click. Yes, sir.
So you started 20 years ago, right? You had other kids, the time schedule was crazy. You're staying up in the morning. Now 20 years later, what is your best time for writing?
Oh, my best time for writing. Well, for a long time I really, it's a very funny thing. My writing day used to stop at 3 o'clock because that's when the kids came home. And there is still something in me. It's actually my favorite time to write. It's sort of after 3 in the afternoon. And I think I still feel that I'm getting away with something. It's like, ooh, look, it's 4 o'clock and I have not picked anybody up from band practice. And I like it, and I do. I write a little faster. I tend, not right now because I'm sort of pushing on a deadline, but you know, I noodle around in the morning, you know, maybe I go to the gym, something like that. I do sort of business correspondence, things like Patrice inviting me, you know, all that kind of stuff. Then I check the mailbox although mail doesn't come until like 2 in the afternoon, but I like to check in the morning anyhow, you never know. We'll walk down the driveway, you know, happily, although my children are no longer in the house, they get bored. You know, I get a phone call, oh, I have to go to the grocery store, why don't you talk to me while I pick up the cereal, or I have a granddaughter, Izzy, for whom I wrote Little Sweet Potato. So every once in a while, you know, she hasn't gotten around to going to daycare. I know I make it sound like she drives herself. Her parents haven't taken her to daycare yet, so she'll call. She'll go, hi, Nana, what you doing? And it's exactly actually like my kids were, because I don't think they ever thought that I actually did anything. I think they thought I just sat around and waited for them to show up. And so she's the same way. I have a little outbuilding where I write, which I think of as sort of the shed, or my husband says, oh, you know, your writing room, which Izzy refers to as where we have the tea parties. And I don't think she's ever seen anything else take place there. So usually I make sure that I get going by around 12:30. I kind of give myself the morning to noodle around, except right now where I feel like I'm sort of in a marathon and have to get going. You know, I set the alarm when I'm finishing a book, so you know I'm at my desk by 8, and I'm usually writing until about 8. I can't tell you how I long for that to be over. But that's it. But usually midday I get to it. I usually break it around 7. And sometimes you just sit there, you know. Being a novelist is like being a subsistence farmer. You know, you got to get up, you got to do everything you got to do, you got to plant, you got to weed, you got to water, and half the time it's for nothing. But you still have to show up. So there's a lot of showing up, and where I write, I don't have internet, because that is just, sorry to say, just death for writers. You cannot really make yourself finish that paragraph if you know that you can go see what, you know, the boy you went out with in 9th grade is up to. Or my sister emailed me this. She said, do you know there's a site where you can design your own shoes? I was like, don't even tell me. I said, don't tell me until April. So that's what my routine is like. And I write usually 5 days a week. I mean, I don't always get anything on paper, but I make a serious effort 5 days a week. And if I didn't like my husband, I would probably write 7 days a week. Yes.
You started writing 20 years ago, so you didn't know it's 6, and you kept journals and other kinds of things. Can you talk about your development to understand, to take on the identity of writer? When did
I found it very actually daunting to take on the identity of writer, and I would say I did not even think of myself as a writer until I had a contract for my first book. And this is partially because my folks were journalists. And so there was no romance about writing for me. It was a job. And if you had a byline, especially for my dad, if you had a byline, it didn't mean you were special. It meant you were paying your rent and you were buying groceries, and it was a job. And my dad sat down at his desk every morning. I mean, I have a pretty good work ethic as a writer. I'm not a patch on my father. He sat down every morning by about 9:30. He'd like to stay up late. And then he would break at lunchtime for the tuna fish sandwich that my mother made him. Thank you very much. There's no need to vary that with anything. I think he actually ate a tuna fish sandwich every day for about 40 years. And then he would go back to his desk, and then he would work until about 5:30. And he did that 5 or 6 days a week for about 40 years. And he wrote 700 magazine articles. That's how he made his living as a freelance journalist. And I have to say, I think the great gifts that he gave me, besides his endless curiosity about people, what they do and how they do it, was a sense that this was a job. This was work. It was not a hobby. And if you did it, you should get paid. And if you did it, you should be as good as you can be. And that if you don't take it seriously, nobody else will. He also told me when I was about 17 that it was probably the case that I had inherited some of his worst traits and I would be unable to work for anybody else. So that also prompted me to think about writing as a career. As it turns out, he was right. And I liked to read when I was a kid. I have to say again, if you don't read widely, if you don't read people who are not like you, who are different color or a different gender or a different century or not your taste, you cannot write. Writing is not about telling your story in a way that makes you feel good. That's wonderful if you are writing in your journal, but if you are writing to be read by other people, it has to speak to other people, and therefore you have to have some sense of the bigger world. So I did a lot of reading, and it took me a long time to think of myself as a writer. I actually didn't even tell my parents that I wrote until I had a contract for a book. It just seems so unlikely to me, I have to say. But I will say now, actually based on some of my own reluctance, if you write and it matters to you, you have to take it seriously. You can't be ashamed of it, and you can't try to talk yourself out of it. If it matters to you, you are allowed to care about it. Nobody else will care as much as you. And so you owe it to your work, like any other work, to do the best you can to take it seriously. Yeah. Yes?
Do you plan to write more children's literature?
Well, I probably will write more children's books if it's not too difficult. I had a wonderful time writing it, and I had a wonderful time reading it to people, to kids. I really did. I think I'll probably write a couple more, but I just signed a contract for 2 more novels, and I don't know how much I don't know how much longer I can keep that up. Grace Paley, the writer, was a great friend of mine, and when I was finishing my last novel, Away, we were talking, because there's actually a passage in the book in which one of the characters says, "Goodbye and good luck," which is the title of one of Grace's best short stories, and I was reading it to her. She said, "Don't be shy." I read it to her. And she said to me, she was looking at her watch, and she said, "You know, darling, you think from 50 to 80, it's minutes. It's not minutes, it's seconds." She said, "You have no time to waste." And so I hear that, honestly, it's like wings beating at your back. I hear it all the time. And so if I can do more children's books, I certainly will, because I love them, and I love to read them. And I'm a great admirer of everybody from Eloise to Olivia to, That's Not My Hat. I think there are people who are really enormously gifted children's books writers, and I love to read their work. But probably I'm going to focus on the next book, which is a straight-up novel, and the book after that, which is 12 linked short stories about a family. Anything else I can tell you? Yes?
What responsibilities do you feel that you what is the relationship between the writer and the reader?
I think the relationship between the writer and the reader, is sort of like these two entities meeting in the middle of the road. I think what a reader owes a book is your attention. It would be nice for the writer if you read every sentence. If it's bad writing, you owe them nothing. Hurl the book across the room. It's a great review by Dorothy Parker once in which she said, "This is not a book to be passed over lightly. This is a book to be thrown with great force against a wall." So if it's a terrible book, don't read it. But if it's a pretty good book, make the effort. Read the sentence. Give it a shot. Maybe open up a book by an author you thought was not for you, and give them an opportunity to persuade you. What the writer owes the reader, it seems to me, is the best possible work you know how to do. I don't think it's about moral or immoral. I think it is about the best writing you know how to do. I think you owe, for me, you owe the reader a good sentence and a good story. And what they do with that is entirely up to them. I have written things for which I've gotten hate mail. I've written things for which people have said, "Thank you so much. It moved me. This was my story," and everything in between. And so I don't think the writer has much control over that. But I do feel that I have an obligation for it to matter to me, right? The story and the way I tell it and the sentence, Chekhov says, "No tears for the writer, no tears for the reader." And I think that's not just tears. I think it has, to me, work has to have heart. Not everybody feels this way. Some people really are only interested in the sentence, which for me is like the icing on the cake. But you want there to be a cake too. You want there to be a story as well as the beautiful sentence. So I feel like my job is to tell the most interesting story I know how to create in the clearest and most beautiful language that I can. And by beautiful, I don't mean pretty. I mean that it really does what it's supposed to do.
Do you have a sense of
Well, you know, you want, there's a great quote from somebody that said, you know, you want the ending of a book to be both a surprise and inevitable. In other words, you don't want it a big bow. When I was a girl, I grew up reading magazines. My folks got, I mean, all the magazines that don't exist anymore. They got Saturday Evening Post, and they got all these things. And there was always fiction in them, which you also don't get much of anymore. And, you know, what I discovered as a little girl is that the guy with the green eyes and the high cheekbones is probably going to make you very unhappy. And the little tubby guy who owns the gas station is probably going to be the hero. And you knew that after the second paragraph. And so there's something very comforting about that kind of fiction. That's not the kind that I write, and so tying it up with a big bow isn't really available to me. But wanting to play the string out and give each character their moment. I don't think there are any minor characters. I think if you write them, they should be major characters, even if we only see them for a few minutes. But usually when I come to the end of a chapter, I know it. The end of a novel is something you have to really brace yourself for as a writer. It takes like an extra couple of months on its own, because that's the moment as a writer where you go, here it is. This is what I believe, people. It's like the flop in poker. It's like, here it is. And you have to mean it. And you have to be comfortable with it. And I sometimes in my books, my endings, I think appear more ambiguous than they seem to me. But that also probably represents a wish not to tie it up with a big bow. But usually, I think if you've been writing for a while, you can hear it. It just sort of lingers in the air a little bit like a musical note. And you know, yes, sir.
You have a sense of natural wit about you, which keeps the reader involved, which is a gift.
We sure hope so, yes.
But where do you get something like straight ink, the stockings, the nylon, and the pack of Lucky Strikes, and the Hershey bar? I mean, where do you find that?
For this book, I had to do a fair amount of reading during this particular pre- and post-World War II period. But once you know that women have seams at the backs of their stockings, you know, first of all, if you've seen any movie ever from that period, you know that women are always, in that sort of fascinating way, actually straightening the backs of their stockings. And so it's just paying attention. You know, I watched movies from that period. I did a lot of reading. There are a couple of terrific research books. And so if I am that character, this is my world. The point of research is not to dot the book with things that seem true. It's to make the reader not think about them at all. Now it is 1941. Now as a sign of affection for your mistress, you bring her a package of cigarettes and a candy bar. And you know, you don't want to mix up the reader. You don't want suddenly somebody saying, how about a Diet Coke if it's 1941? And so that's the function of research. It's just to give another layer of something that seems true. And it's a lot, and that part I have to say is a lot of fun. Yes, sir.
Oh, I'm learning the rules of engagement to college writing, so to speak. When you're doing your own creative writing, do you follow any set rules from a college education point, or you just go with the flow and coming up with your own novels?
I didn't actually take any English classes when I was in college. I was a political science and a theater major. And I didn't, so I've actually never taken a creative writing class, which was good in a lot of ways. It has left me at a certain disadvantage in the area of the comma, which I still struggle with, but fortunately I have proofreaders who will I once had actually a wonderful proofreader. She was really famous at the New Yorker, and she wrote at the top of the page, I think what she wanted to say is, would you please come in, Miss Bloom? But you know, she wasn't my principal, but she just sort of circled it and she said, very interesting, by which I could tell she meant, where did you go to school? How did you not learn this? And so I did go back actually and read Strunk and White, and the Chicago Manual of Style, so that I would not embarrass myself as a writer.
Can you repeat that?
Strunk and White and Chicago Manual of Style, you just want, I mean, to me, the story you want to tell is the important thing. But you want to make sure that you follow sort of the rules of language enough so that people can read it comfortably.
Okay.
It's being able to ride the horse,
Right.
is how I think of it. And I really did have to sort of fix myself up in the comma department because I felt that I was not serving my work. Because if somebody's going to stumble over my punctuation, they're not going to hear the story. And so those are the only rules I think you have to pay attention to. It's like know your grammar, know how to spell, and then open the barn door. And then you tell your story after that. Yes?
You mentioned that you did some work in television, and I was just wondering, what was your experience? How was it different working in television versus writing short stories and writing novels?
Working in television is completely, I mean, it's a lot of fun. I like it very much, but it's a collaborative field. And, you know, I sit in my little room and I write, and if my publisher likes it, they publish it, and if they don't, they don't. And we don't have a lot of chit-chat about it. I mean, we have some chit-chat, but not a lot. In television, you know, you can say to somebody, I have this great idea about a bunch of psychotherapists in New Haven and their personal lives and their professional lives, and somebody will actually say to you, as they did to me, how about if they were physical therapists in Malibu? And this part of you know, you're always torn because, you know, you want the money. On the other hand, I'm thinking, I can't actually write that show. And I said, that sounds great, and probably the next person coming into the room will be able to do that for you. So it's always a good idea in television if you know what your limitations are. I have walked away from a couple of very promising projects having to say to the network, I don't think I will make you happy, which is what I usually say when I'm leaving. And on the other hand, if you have good collaborators, good producers, it can be a lot of fun, and you have a chance of creating a good show. And it's not the case that all good television is only on cable. You see a lot of good television that is not, but it's a different set of requirements. When you are writing for a network, you understand that the function is the advertising. That's the engine that is driving the television show. That's what's making it possible. That our job is to keep you watching long enough to watch that very dense chunk of commercials, and then to come back to the show. And so it's a different, it has a different beat and a different rhythm, but I usually skip a couple of years of pitching because I'm usually writing a novel, and then I think to myself, wouldn't it be great? And then somebody will send me some videos, some DVDs of some pilots that are coming out, and you know, there's usually one that I think, oh, that is really good, I couldn't do that, and then the other ones I think, oh, that is so bad, I couldn't do that either. That's just terrible. But it's always interesting. It's because I spend most of my time writing the way I wish to write, I don't mind collaborating. I think for people who only write in television, it's sometimes very difficult for them. They make a lot of money, but there is a sense that they never get to tell the story they want to tell. Yes?
How do you organize your writing? I don't know if I consider myself a writer, but I write every day, and I am very scattered, and I have a story that I'm working on that's a science fiction piece, and I have an idea, and I write a chapter, but it doesn't, I'm working right now and slowing down and like trying to put the chapters together. It sounds really crazy, but I think that's like my biggest weakness, but also my strength, because it's so sporadic and real, and the characters are fresh, but yet it's just a mess right now. Like, I know if you were to read it, it wouldn't make any sense.
Well, there are two things about that. If it suits you, then there's no need for anybody else to have an opinion about it, which is fantastic.
Like, how do you organize?
You might say to yourself, I'm going to tell myself, and I'm going to dictate it into the tape recorder, the story of this story. Chapter 1, we begin. This happens, this happens, this happens, then the planet blows up, Then this happens, this happens, this happens. Then she develops gills. Then this happens, this happens, this happens. Then he's a horse. This happens, this happens, this happens. The rocket ship takes off. Whatever it is, from the beginning to the end. You know what the story needs to be. So then you have an outline. So then you can begin to see where your chapters go. So that's the practical fix. The other thing that you might say to yourself is, do I want to finish this book? Because we are all so much more talented at the beginning of the process than at the end of the process when it has kicked our rear ends. And so there is something to be said for being scattered and not being sure where this goes or that goes, because you're never done. And so you are always the author of an about-to-be brilliant science fiction novel, as opposed to the author of one that is finished and flawed. It's just something to be mindful of. Yes, sir?
You mentioned about doing, was it 12-chapter book about a family?
A 12-story novel. Yeah, they'll all be linked short stories.
12-story novel.
Yes.
But it's one novel.
And instead of chapters, they will be linked short stories. So the characters will appear again and again and again from different points of view.
Is that fiction or is that?
That's fiction. That's just a novel. I mean, every time somebody does it, people act as if it's never been heard of before, but people have been doing this since like 1920. People write that way frequently. And I think it's an interest, for me, who loves short stories and is working on novels, it's nice to be able to do both. Yes?
To what extent have you had your characters take over, and what do you allow them to do to the story as it moves forward?
Well, you hope that they will take over in the story. You hope that they will help you out, and you're not just sitting there staring at the ceiling for yet another day. It's not like Alice Walker, who used to say, you know, when I go to bed at night, all my characters come and sit at the foot of my bed. I would find very alarming. But they don't. You know, in my house, if somebody's sitting at the foot of your bed, they're going, Mommy, where's the allergy medicine? You know, they're not my characters. But you hope that you see them clearly enough and you hear them clearly enough that they begin to move and that you give them opportunities. What I always say is, if you don't know your character, take them to the grocery store. You know, to take them shopping. Take them for a drive so you can begin to see what they do and what they say. And then you hope that, you know, certainly not everything in this book has turned out the way I thought it would, including the person who I thought was the primary narrator, who is not anymore. So, you know, the characters surprise you, the book surprises you, and that's why you have to stay with it. You have to stay with it long enough for it to begin to take its own turns, I would say. Yes? Oh, well, I'm a terrific crybaby, so there's that. So, you know, you can find me at my computer crying, thinking how much this sucks, and that I will never write a good sentence again. So that happens sometimes. Sometimes I go and read the last couple of pages that I wrote a few days ago just to remind myself that I did, as recently as 48 hours ago, know how to write. But then you decide, I mean, then it's how much do you care? You know, there's nothing wrong with taking some time off. It's not a sprint, you know? And then I go back, and sometimes I just give myself explicit permission to write bad sentences. I just go, all that matters is that I get it on the page. I can fix it later. It can be terrible, and believe me. But that's fine, and that's usually how I coax myself into writing again, by saying that there's no standard I'm trying to meet. It could be a terrible sentence. It just needs to be words on a page. Somebody in the back had their hand up.
I was wondering, you said you're on the contract for 2 books now. Did you have the ideas for both of them and pitch them to the publisher, or the publisher came to you and said, we want something more?
I I have a long-term relationship with Random House. They have been my publisher since my second book. And I think they were hoping I might, be able to turn out a couple more books. I had a specific idea for the more conventional novel, and I had a more general idea for the linked short stories, and they liked them both. So that's the good news. The bad news is I have to deliver them both in the next 6 years. Yes.
Yeah. You mentioned your curiosity in observing others and the importance of empathy, and a little bit about eavesdropping. What lessons have you learned as a writer from just observing your surroundings?
Well, probably not so much my surroundings as the people in them, but what I have observed over time is that you do not know other people from looking at them. That what we know from looking at them is who looks like us and who doesn't, who wears what we would wear and who doesn't wear what we would wear, who does their hair the way we like and who doesn't, who has, who wears the hat, who doesn't wear the hat, but you know nothing about these people. And that one of the first things you have to do as a writer is give up what makes you comfortable, is to not draw conclusions about other people, is to let them finish their sentences, to let people show you who they are without you being sure that you know, because of course you're so smart, you know everything. The point of being a writer is not to be the smartest kid in the room. The point of being a writer is to see and then be able to tell. So I think that's probably what I've learned. I think I'm a good judge of character, and I am constantly surprised by people. Maybe last question. Yeah? Anything else? Anything else I can do for anybody? In that case, thank you very much for coming tonight.